This is the Flyerdelphia podcast, part of sportstalkphilly.com, with Kevin Durso, Rob Riches, and Dan Heaning. Hello, Flyers fans, and welcome to another edition of the Flyerdelphia podcast, part of sportstalkphilly.com. I'm your host, Kevin Durso, joined by Dan Heaning. And well, what a difference 2 weeks makes. 2 weeks ago, I did the podcast with Rob and essentially said it was time for a change and focused on the easy target, which was Dave Hakstol. Not necessarily because it was easy. I thought there was nothing else that Dave Hakstol could try to do to motivate this team to be better or improve what they were doing. They were falling into an identity of being mediocre and being an underachiever, and a lot of that falls on the players. But I thought the voice was getting stale, and I thought Hakstol was kind of getting honest to a fault. He was speaking as if he knew that if things didn't change quickly, there would be repercussions, and he could be one of them. And as I said then, he sounded kind of defeated. So 2 weeks later, and 6 games have been completed since then, and the Flyers have picked up 11 points in the standings, the most in the NHL in that time. And let me bring in Dan now, and let's start by, we'll run down the results quickly, and let's start with the 4-game road trip and what that did for the Flyers, and then get to the last 2 games on home ice. So obviously, the Flyers go on the road, and we published and posted the last podcast the day before this road trip began. So that was October 29th. The road trip began on October 30th. And by that point, we knew that change wasn't coming immediately. The team had already made the trip out to the West Coast. Nothing was going to happen until, at the very least, the trip was over and they made it back to Philadelphia. So there was a 4-game window, and we had talked about this a little bit on the last one, where there's a 4-game window, and the idea was if things didn't change in terms of the results and the level of play, then changes were probably coming soon. They go out and they nearly find a way to fall into an overtime game with Anaheim, who is badly beat up with injuries and a lot of players out of the lineup. They managed to respond to a late tying goal with a game-winning goal for a 3-2 win in Anaheim. They go out 2 nights later, take care of business against the Kings team that was struggling. Then they get a team like San Jose and get off to a really good start and play pretty well throughout, but the third period becomes a little passive. They end up on the wrong end of 2 goals, one with under 5 minutes to go in the third period and 13 seconds into overtime, so they lose 4-3, but they get a point out of the game, and then they close out the road trip with a 5-2 win over Arizona, who, coming into that game, was on a 5-game winning streak. So many different positives on that end. Then they come, well, like we said, we'll get into the home games, but just to give the results really quick, there was the 5-4 win over Arizona last Thursday, and then Saturday's 4-0 win over Chicago. And let me get to Dan here for a second. What were your thoughts before the road trip started, and then where the Flyers were when that road trip ended?
Well, before the road trip started, my thoughts were pretty much the same as yours, Kevin. I didn't think that Dave Hakstol was gonna. He was probably going to survive the month, but I thought he was on his way out, and I was already looking at guys that could replace him. In the 2 weeks, there have been some coaching changes around the NHL. Joel Quenneville is no longer with the Chicago Blackhawks. That's a big time move. That's a head coach that 30 other teams would want. And then before that, one of the Flyers' opponents, the LA Kings, John Stevens was on his last legs there, and I thought John Stevens wasn't given the time of day in LA. Really, he did a really good job last season with a bunch of guys who have no speed. They made it to the playoffs. Their lack of speed was exposed by the Vegas Golden Knights, and they didn't do anything to improve their team speed. They just brought in Ilya Kovalchuk, and they expected everything to be fine. So I was looking at John Stevens as a guy to come back. I thought that would have been a stereotypical Flyer move, somebody that they got rid of, long ago, and they bring back, and he's probably a better coach now than he was initially with the Flyers. But I thought he would pretty much follow the same mold that Dave Hakstol has right now with the Flyers, except that I think John Stevens has a proven track record of developing young players, and he's proven he's a great transitional coach. You have to give him that, because last season with the Kings. That was one of the Kings' best things. And during his time with the Flyers, I don't know if the Flyers had ever been that good of a transitional team since, because that team knew how to counterpunch to the team with Richards, Carter, all them. So going into the week, I thought that I was pretty much expecting a John Stevens hire, and just having I wasn't able to watch the games as they happened. I just binged all of them, and they jumped ahead. They got the lead most of those games. I think pretty much all of those games. They scored the first goal, and the amazing thing is that, especially in the Western Conference, the Western road trip, they counterpunched. They knew how to counterpunch, not in the transitional way, but as soon as somebody scored a goal, they scored a goal right back, took the momentum away. Especially in that game against Anaheim. That game against Anaheim was ripe for them blowing it, because they played well for, what was it, 55 minutes of that game. They did not play poorly. That was a really well constructed game by them. They had their moments, they had their hiccups. Travis Sanheim did not have a good game against Anaheim, but it looked like they were going to hold on. Then they took that penalty towards the end of the game, and you could have kind of feel it. Excuse me, you could feel it. You could feel that Anaheim was going to score towards the end of the game and tie it up, and they did. But the one thing you wouldn't expect is that they went right back on the very next shift, and Nolan Patrick scores on on a great goal. You really have to be fortunate if you're the Flyers. Or you have to feel fortunate if you're the Flyers that you played the Anaheim Ducks, who are absolutely wretched defensively, and and Ryan Miller was playing, but poor John Gibson has had to endure that this entire season, because that guy sees like 40 shots every night that he plays. But that was a good start, because then they got LA, and LA is not good. I think you and I could beat goaltender and hold them to 1 or 2 goals.
Might have to be at this point.
Oh my God, it's terrible. But like, you feel bad for Jack Campbell, the young kid that they got there replacing John Quick, because he's hurt. That kid's playing his heart out. I just had to cut a game with for LA, and he played really well in that game. I think it was against Calgary. That was just, LA can't score. LA cannot score at all.
Yeah, and Campbell's out with an injury now too, so they're on their third stringer.
Oh, good Lord, that team. And you really, the scope of this win streak, or this point streak, I should say, for the Flyers, is they only played one really good team, and that was San Jose, and they were up there with San Jose the entire time. This was definitely not that 8-2 game that they played against them. I think it was 8-2. This was definitely not that game. They scored the first goal. They were with San Jose the entire time. They had the lead going into the third period. That was as well as you could have played that. They just had. I'm just going to bring this up now. The Flyers' penalty kill is their Achilles heel. It has been. They scored a power play. The opposition scored a power play goal in practically every game that has happened in the last 2 weeks. It's been a theme. As I said before, I binge watched all these games in the last 2 days, and I was just like, well, here's a power play. They're probably going to score on it, and they do. It's a huge problem for this team. If they don't know how to correct this, it's gonna bite them in February and March.
Yeah, I mean, let me start with this from the very beginning of the road trip too. I mean, I said 2 weeks ago when we had the last podcast episode put up that my estimation was that for Dave Haxtell to still be the head coach of this team out of that road trip, they needed 5 points on the West Coast trip, and I'll temper that a little bit in a way, because of the fact that I said 5 at first, and when they won the first 2 games, especially the way they won in Anaheim, they play a solid game, almost look like they're going to blow the game, and then get the late goal from Nolan Patrick. Okay, that's a good one. And then they really came out and actually did what they were supposed to do against LA, especially in that third period. That was a closeout third period where you kind of wait for that right opportunity. They had more than just that opportunity that Claude Giroux had in the third period to actually extend the lead beyond 3-2. But they kept pressing a little bit, and they got the opportunity eventually that led to a goal that extended the lead beyond just the 1-goal game. Because in a 1-goal game, just like in Anaheim, you're waiting for the inevitable game-tying situation. You're waiting for something that presents itself to be a spot where it's all going to fall apart. You could say that the situation in the LA game didn't happen in the third period. It happened in the first period because they had to kill a 2-man advantage, and knowing the penalty kill, you're going, this isn't going to work out. something's going to happen here, and they actually get through that stretch, but they do allow a power play goal later in the game.
Just real quick, they also got a huge break in that game. That I believe it's the Oscar Lindblom goal. That was a kicking motion.
Yeah,
And they got
it was, and as I was watching that, I wasn't sure that I'm looking at it. I'm going, the stick's there, but like, let's be real. I think that's just a straight kick. But they caught a break, and it doesn't happen often. You have to take it when it does happen. So
but
you're right.
That kind of changed the scope of the game. The Flyers were up 2-1, I believe, at that point. And so that set it to 3-1, and LA's not coming back by 2 goals. But LA did score right after that, or not too long after that, and they made it a 3-2 game. But the Flyers did, bounce back and then take a stranglehold on that game towards the end of it. But like, you can't undercut. Like, Flyers fans on Twitter will always say, like, "Oh, the refs hate us. The refs hate us." Da, 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 da. That's a good indication of, like, yeah, the breaks kind of do balance out. Like, the Flyers will, run into situations where the refs will make a bad call on them, but they got a game breaking kicking goal against the Kings. It may be a team you don't really need that break, but in the cusp of that game, definitely helped. Definitely was. It's the game winning goal, so it's nothing to sneeze at.
Yeah, absolutely. And so getting back to the point of those 2 games specifically, when I said they needed 5 points on the road trip, when they got 4 right away, it kind of made me think, well, at that point, really, if anything that happens from here is going to keep jobs secure for at least until you get to the homestand now. Because at the very least, you came out and you responded to 6-1 embarrassment against the Islanders on home ice, another game that is incredibly lopsided on home ice. And you did win the next 2 games. You had a good response. You've started in the right direction. It's not necessarily been the greatest process in the world for winning games, but you've won games. So you've gotten the points. You've turned the corner a little bit. Maybe you are turning the corner and putting something together. Who knows? They play the San Jose game. They play San Jose way better than they did the previous month, or at that point it was probably about 3 weeks. And yeah, was it unfortunate the way that they went down? Certainly it was, because that third period, you did enter with a lead. You had a chance to try to play up to that. If they play that third period the way they tried to play the way they played in LA, and wait for that opportunity, not necessarily wait for it, but trying to create that opportunity, then maybe you extend the lead. It's a tough situation though, because San Jose, as we saw in October, is a great transitional team. You give them the time and space to make a play, and the opportunity coming back with an odd man rush, they usually make you pay for it. So what was disappointing, I guess, was seeing San Jose get some of those opportunities and not score on them, having Cal Pickard play a really great game overall and get beat on a really good, well-placed shot by Joe Thornton that ties the game and then forces overtime, and then whatever the hell happened in that 3-on-3 that, where there's miscommunication, and miscommunication costs you in 3-on-3. So that's how you lose a point there. But then you respond again, you play a team like Arizona. And it was funny. I was on Twitter during that Arizona game, and it was funny. I had people tweeting back going, it does help that they're playing Arizona in this game. It's making them look good. And it's like, people didn't realize Arizona was on a 5-game winning streak, had one of the better second half records the previous season. And that's not a team that's a pushover here anymore like they used to be. They're better than what people want to believe. So it's still a quality win there. But I did find it funny, as you mentioned, Dan, that over that time, in between the home game against the Islanders before this whole road trip started and the time that they get home, by that point, you're absolutely right. Look at the names that start popping up. Rob and I sat here 2 weeks ago talking about the possibility of having to make a change, and the only free agent that we could think of who at least that was out there with no news attached to him about whether he's going to coach or not was Dave Tippett. That was the only guy we could think of, unless Daryl Sutter was going to come out of retirement. And there's a lot of people who kind of look at that and go, that's not the path you want to go down. So at that point, it turned into kind of an internal struggle. And so at that point, are you going to promote one of your assistant coaches, or are you going to grab Scott Gordon from the minors? That was pretty much the limit of options. Now, all of a sudden, they come home and John Stevens is available and Joel Quenneville is available. And I think you're right, Dan. John Stevens would have been the kind of typical move if they were to do anything. Quenneville, to me, would have been kind of a Peter Laviolette type from when John Stevens got fired with the Flyers that first time around. It's getting a guy who already had the background that you would hope would take that team to the next level, because it's a mid-season move, and this is where they are at that situation. Time to turn it around. Time to make it better and perform like they think they should. So Quenneville would come in just like Laviolette did with the resume. Regardless, I liken this stretch of games to this 6-game winning streak the Flyers had last season immediately after they lost 10 straight games with an 0-5 record. There's not that many differences in the two stretches from one year to the next, other than maybe how long the losing streak was before, and so far the length of a winning streak. It's a team that's struggling more in certain areas than others going into this recent stretch of winning. It's a team that people felt should be doing better than what they were. It's a fan base that was calling for change, and change becomes to the extreme. Fire the coach, trade a player, do something. Just do something. It's the meme with the stick, poking at something. Just do something. And after all of that happened, it's a 10 game losing streak. They had a team meeting in the middle of that. The 10th loss was a shutout loss to Boston. And they go out and they win 6 straight games, and it sort of quells everything for a second. And this virtually did the same thing. It's just not as long of a losing streak. They had lost 3 games in a row, 7 of the first 11, and a big difference between those games to me and the losses during the 10-game losing streak a year ago is that the Flyers last year during that 10-game losing streak were starting games off really well and not finishing games. They would go into third periods with a 3-1 lead or a 4-2 lead, and they could never protect the 2-goal lead. They'd end up losing those games in overtime, or they would end up having these lower scoring games where they maybe got off to a decent start. They had a game, the 9th loss on that 10-game losing streak last year was to San Jose, and they scored the first goal in that game and then ended up losing 3-1. So they would come out with the right approach. They'd start off well, and then something would happen that would just snowball into bigger things, and it would take away a win, and they would lose the 2 points in a game. This time, what was happening was they were falling behind at the start of games, probably about as consistently as you can. I mean, in those first 11 games, they gave up the first goal 10 times. And from there, they're chasing the game. So this changed the dynamic. This whole recent stretch changed the whole dynamic because they were starting better. They got off to better starts. They scored the first goal in all 6 games that they've played since we were talking about this before, about making a change. So it has changed things. It really has. The thing now I think that we need to kind of figure out at this point, or one of the big discussions that we can have at this point, is do we need to pump the brakes on all of this? And I'm saying this in 2 different ways. First of all, do you pump the brakes on all the other talk that was going on before this 6-game stretch? Firing the coach, trading someone, the GM's job could be in danger for all you know. Do we pump the brakes on that just because the results are better? But do you also keep in mind that you pump the brakes on the recent success and go how quickly things can change in this league, and how quickly on a night-by-night basis you may not be the team that you were before, and it could all go away. You could also have something happen that changes the whole outlook of the season. You never know how everything looks and how everything goes. At one point in time during part of that West Coast trip, this was the kind of the extreme of the whole thing was you started Cal Pickard in a scheduled start in San Jose, which was an interesting choice, and it almost worked out for you. Then you were probably going to play Brian Elliott in the Arizona game on the road, knowing that you had to send Michael Neuvert back to Philadelphia to be evaluated. There's still no further update on him other than day-to-day, I believe. So he's still not available. And then that Sunday in between the 2 games, you lose Brian Elliott due to a collision in practice. He's not able to even dress for Monday's game against Arizona, the final game of that road trip. Now you have to call Alex Lyon up to kind of take his place and at least serve as backup. Pickard's going to get another start, and then Brian Elliott comes back. But it's the unstable nature of the goaltending in general. You've had 3 goaltenders up here consistently, to say the least, even though Neuvert got 3 periods worth of action in and then was back on IR. But bottom line is you've had 3 goalies up here who are expected to be up here consistently. You've rotated them in some capacity or tried to. And at the same time, you keep in mind that Elliott's needed a little bit of time just for a break. He does need a mental break or a way to physically recuperate a little bit from some of the work that he's seen. Pickard's been good when he's had to be, but then again, you tried to get another start out of him in the first home game of the homestand against Arizona, and maybe not his fault completely, ended up having to throw Brian Elliott in there anyway. So kind of interesting how that works out.
I'm glad you brought that up, though, Kevin, because one of the things that when I was watching these games, and like I've already complained about the penalty kill, and there's an old adage in hockey: your best, best penalty killer is your goaltender. And to bring this kind of full circle around, like what you were talking about before this, before the point streak, before the road trip, that what do the Flyers do to improve? What do the Flyers do to get themselves out of this jam? And the talks for William Nylander have died down. There were like at the beginning of the month, there was this rumor flying around that the Flyers would be going after William Nylander. I didn't really see as to how that would help, because the Flyers are already incredibly log jammed at forward, and you'd be trading a defenseman most likely and other pieces for that guy. And you need to fortify goaltending and defense if you're the Flyers, honestly, because it's a situation where you're not defending. It's not that you're not scoring. It's not you're not defending. So one of the thoughts that I had while I was watching these games is, you know, because like if I'm not able to watch these games, I'm still hearing these things as the days roll by. Like Brian Elliott's hurt, Cal Pickard has to play, Michael Neuvert is hurt again. The Flyers' goaltending situation is sheer chaos, even though Pickard and Elliott have been playing not well, because the last time before the winning streak, winning streak. I keep saying winning streak. Before the point streak, before the road trip, the Flyers had the worst save percentage out of all the teams in the National Hockey League. I think it was like 889 or something to that extent. And so the thought that I was having while I was watching these games is, you might not be able to go out and get yourself a defenseman that's going to make an impact for the Flyers, but you have pieces at forward, and you might be able to go out there and try and get a goaltender. Now, I don't want to, throw things out there just for the sake of throwing them out there, but there are goaltenders out there that have, um, you know, not that much term left on their contract, and there's a strategy to get them out of town if it happen if the guy leaves. There's a strategy for them to leave, and the guy I was looking at is Simeon Varlamov at Colorado. He's got 1 year left on his contract. They have Philip Grubauer already, and they desperately need somebody else to score other than that top line. So what I was thinking, and feel free to break this down, call me stupid, Wayne Simmons for Simeon Varlamov trade. I feel like that would be good for both teams, even though Simeon Varlamov right now is clearly the Avalanche's best player. But if they're planning on him leaving anyway, and they're in the division of doom, like if they try to make a run for it, like they got to be sure that they're going to do it, because they've got Winnipeg and Nashville and Dallas. Minnesota's playing above their heads right now. They have to be sure that they can make the playoffs, because if they don't, they'll probably lose Varlamov for nothing. And in this situation, they can try and improve their secondary scoring, and the Flyers can have. And now I know Varlamov has a history of getting hurt, but at least you have somebody there with Brian Elliott where you can actually have a stable, at least a more stable group of guys, rather than having to go off of poor Michael Neuvert, who, please, man, just retire. Like, you don't have to do it now, get your money, but like, don't do this to yourself anymore, because you just keep getting hurt every year. And then Calvin Pickard, who he's done a yeoman's job, but he's still kind of an NHL, AHL tweener. So I was just curious as to what you would think of that potential deal.
It's not as outrageous as it seems, for sure. I mean, I don't think it's likely, just because I think that the Flyers have a lot of trust in Brian Elliott, and I do think I don't view what's going on with Brian Elliott right now, or on the road trip, before the road trip, or whatever. The collision in a practice is more of a freak thing than Michael Neuvert has something wrong with him again. Whether it's upper body, lower body, doesn't matter. It's always physical with Neuvert. I think one of the things that I don't like about some of the Flyers practices, and I'm saying it because I've seen it or heard it on a number of occasions, is sometimes I think they tend to go a little bit too physical with these practices, at least around the net. And it's the position that you need to have in a bubble right now, because you can't afford to lose one or the other. Now, as has been the case for the last 3 years or 4 years, you've been losing Michael Neuvert left and right since he signed on here. The first time around, eventually got a contract extension, and hasn't really played out much of that either. Beside the point, Elliott has had his moments. I'll say it that way. I'm not saying he's been great. He's been solid at times. I think a perfect example is, as you look at those last couple of games, and entering in relief on Thursday against Arizona and then the Chicago game, that's Brian Elliott on a hot streak. That's Brian Elliott getting hot for you at that time and making the saves that he needs to make. I thought the game against Chicago was one of the best he's ever had as a Flyer, let alone just this season. It's one of the best he's had in his time here, period. Doesn't mean that that's sustainable, though. That's the thing about it. It doesn't mean that he's going to give you that every night. He's let in some soft ones this season and last, but I think the thing with the Flyers is that they're, and look, Varlamov makes a lot of sense because of the fact that he is on a contract that would expire. So it doesn't corner you into a situation where you lose the ability to utilize the prospects you have as soon as next season. But I do think that there's a progression in mind. And at the very least, as I was watching the last couple of games that Elliott's played, I could see the merit for them potentially keeping a guy like that around beyond this season as a backup option when you determine that insert prospect here, usually the name that goes with that is Carter Hart, but insert prospect here is ready to be your number one starter. I don't have any issue with the Flyers keeping Brian Elliott around and making him the backup when the time comes and having him play 20 maybe 25 games a year. If Carter Hart's playing 50 to 55, of course. Different, obviously, at that point, it's a different story. Or whoever it is. I don't know that I would want Alex Lyon playing 50 games a year, like that. But I certainly understand your merit behind the question and the proposal of that is because realistically, in the right situation, who wants to sit there and say that the goalie you have to rely on, like they did in that Arizona game on the road, is Cal Pickard? It's not to say that he hasn't done a great job filling in when asked and doing everything that he's needed to be around this team and to try to keep this team in games. He certainly did that in the third period against San Jose when the Sharks were just pressing through the whole period. The Flyers sat back. He kept you in the game until eventually it finally broke, but still got you to overtime, made a couple of late saves after Thornton's goal that got you the point. That still counts for something. And then he had a really good game against Arizona. Kept you in. The first 10 minutes of that game were no different than some of the others where the Flyers came out, kind of weathered the storm. That's, without giving up the first goal in that Arizona game, that was Vegas all over again. Weather the storm. Here they come. They're going to come in waves. And then when it turns back around, the momentum's going to shift and they take control. And that's exactly how that played out. I just think they have a lot of trust in Brian Elliott to be the guy for the rest of this year or at least be mainly the guy for the rest of this year. But I think that it's difficult to put anything on it because it's still early. We haven't even hit the quarter point of the season yet. And by not hitting the quarter point, they obviously, the reason that they picked Alex Lyon to come up and serve as a backup is because it was the easy thing to do in that situation. He's been up before. He's played in games. Even though he was coming off an injury, okay, he's got enough NHL experience that we can just sit him on the bench for one game here and hope for the best or whatever. But if this was February or March, who's to say that it wouldn't be one of these prospect goalies because of performance, or that it's not Carter Hart because they just deem him ready to go at that point? It changes based on when it is in the season. But at this point of the season, it would have been way too early for them to grab a guy like Hart, or even, they could have used Stolarz and said do the same thing, just sit there. But it's a matter of when the time comes, whenever it is in the year, that may be when they make a call that's a little bit different than just a guy who's supposed to be a filler at that point.
It isn't lost on me that I bring this up at a time where Brian Elliott just got a shutout. But the idea that the method to my madness isn't so much get Brian Elliott out of here because, at the beginning of during the offseason, I was the one saying Brian Elliott deserves another chance because I thought he played well. It isn't really his fault that he got destroyed by the Pittsburgh Penguins. It was just where the two organizations are. The Penguins can score goals and the Flyers defense was young. And so you have that, that recipe for disaster. But my idea now is the Patrick Division, Metropolitan for you young people. It is wide open, especially early on. There is no one that's really taking that division by the horns and saying this division is ours. There's nobody like Tampa Bay and Toronto. There's nobody like Nashville. It's kind of like the Wild West right now. And so the idea that I'm having, why I bring this up now is, how do you make the Flyers great? How do you turn this team this season? I'm not worried about down the road, because down the road is set. That's why I think the idea of firing Hextall is laughable, because he has turned this team from a team that had no future to a team that has probably one of the best futures in the league. Um, but for the scope of this season, I want to figure out, how do you make this team great? How do you make this team stand out in a division where no one is standing out? And so the only way that I could feel you could do that without destroying the vision of next year, 2 seasons down the road, 5 seasons down the road. How do you do that? You go out, you can't get rid of any of your young defensemen. You're not going to be able to trade Andrew McDonald because he hasn't been playing. And you kind of want to hold on to Radko Gudas because he's starting to get his game back. He's playing well. And Christian Folin is, he's stepping up, and he's being a good partner for Shane Gostisbehere right now. So the only way to do that, make this team great, because it's already really good at forward, especially when you get Raffle and JVR back, is to get a goaltender, is to get a guy who can make the stop, but not only make the stop, but do it on a consistent basis, a guy who can steal you a win if you have to go up against the Penguins in the first round, if you got to go up against the Capitals or the Blue Jackets, somebody who can steal you not only just a win, a playoff win, but a playoff series. If you can get a guy like that, and I'm not convinced that Colorado would give up on Varlamov, because I still think that they think they can make the playoffs, because they probably can. But the idea is that you have to figure out how to make this team good, not good, because it's already good. How do you make this team great this season? And it was the same thing with the coaches. Just figuring out how to do that. Is Joel Quenneville could probably do that, but he's probably, taking a knee on this season, or just waiting for the office to fly in.
Right. I think there's two good points to that, because one of the things that's interesting about Wayne Simmonds being part of your trade idea there is that when everything comes back around here, when JVR is back in the lineup, when Michael Raffle's back in the lineup, I look at that situation for a second, because I go, tell me what Dale Weiss has done in the last 2 weeks to demote him from the third line. Or even if you do demote him, maybe you promote Scott Lawton again, because Lawton's been really good on the fourth line. You've got enough players who kind of factor themselves in and have been stepping up and they're role guys. We're not just talking about the top line or something like that. For a good stretch of time, the top line wasn't playing to their standards at all. And you've seen in the last 6 games, Claude Giroux's quietly ranking in the top 5 in points again in the league. And Sean Couturier is putting together a point streak, and as a result, that's making Travis Konechny's game take off. The second line has been consistently good for the 6 games between the way Nolan Patrick's played. Oscar Lindblom's a great partner for him on a line, and it's kind of changed the way that Jake Voracek's game works as well. So there's your good 2 lines again that we had talked about throughout the offseason as well. Then you get to the third line, and there are games where Wayne Simmonds is very present, and there's games where he's not, unless you're going to factor him in on the power play. And even then, JVR is not even a part of this equation right now, and Wayne Simmonds is playing on the second power play unit regardless. So that's something I find interesting before he even gets back into the lineup. The other part of this that I think makes a lot of sense, and a reason why maybe pump the brakes on any trade talk as well for anything, even to take the team from good to great, is because it's hard to sit there and say that we know whether or not they're a great team yet or a good team. The reason I say that is because, okay, you've rebounded. You went through this really bad stretch of games in October. It gave you that fairly typical slow start that we've come to see, 4-7-0, and you get points in your last 6 games, winning 5 of them. Now all of a sudden, like you said, Dan, the Metro's just an absolute logjam of teams, top to bottom, virtually. And it really says a whole lot when a team that has the fan base saying, make a trade, fire the coach, do something with this team because they're not going anywhere as a result. At the same time, you're sitting there saying those things for a team that had 8 points in the standings. It was probably only about 5 or 6 points back of the division lead at that time. They've won 5 of 6. They gain 11 possible points in the standings. They get to 19 in 6 games, and they're second place. So all of a sudden, it changes the whole outlook of the division, and I find it interesting of the timing too, because you're getting up on that situation here. We're going to get to a game on Thursday night that the Flyers will play this week against the New Jersey Devils. And a week from Thursday is that Thanksgiving cutoff where people start to look at the standings and go, well, who's usually there at that time is the ones who normally are there in April. So you've somehow gone from being a team that was hanging around the bottom of not only the Metropolitan Division standings, but you also had, in terms of the conference standings, you were around the bottom of those teams, and now you've climbed into more of a discussion within the division, and that cutoff line of Thanksgiving is coming up, and you're kind of in a perfect spot. The interesting thing is that, it's interesting to talk about. Are they as good as we wanted to believe they are or were going to be at the start of the season, and they're just getting rolling now? Or is this just something that's a short-lived sequence of games where they're putting it together, they're winning, or they're getting it to overtime to get points? I think this whole stretch of games, especially the game against Chicago, which was arguably the best one they've played all season. This is how we felt after the first game against New Jersey 3 weeks into the season. That was a game where the Flyers showed they were capable of staying with a team in a close competitive game. At that given point in time, New Jersey was off to a start in their first 5 games where they won 4 of the first 5. So in everybody's mind at that point, that's a really good team that's gotten off to a really hot start, has a lot of weapons, has been scoring a ton, and that's a competitive team, and they were able to stay with them in a close game and get the goal that turned it in their favor late in the game. I think you want to see the point of this is that you want to start seeing this against better teams. And like I said, Arizona's a much better team than they were a year ago, but they are a team that's going to hover around that playoff line all year, probably below it more than above it, but they're going to hover around that line. They ended up losing to San Jose. It was a well-played game for a good stretch of it. The third period strategy wasn't exactly great, but you got it to overtime, you got a point. It's been no secret that it hasn't been the greatest start to the season for Anaheim with all the injuries. LA had to fire a coach following a game against the Flyers. Chicago fired their coach right before they came to play the Flyers. So that tells you what kind of state those 3 teams are in right there. So to me, skip Tuesday's game against Florida, because while Florida has been a little bit resurgent lately, they've got a 4-game winning streak of their own as they come to Philadelphia for Tuesday. And New Jersey has kind of been the opposite end. They've fallen off a little bit since having a really, really great start. The game against Tampa Bay on Saturday is the big one to kind of just determine where they are. That's going to be your measuring stick game for how they stand against a better team. And it's not exactly the greatest team to say, let's do this as a measuring stick, because Tampa Bay is really above and beyond a lot of teams in the conference, not just in the Metropolitan Division or above the Flyers, but above teams in their own division as well. So you still want to see what this team has for a team like Tampa Bay if they can play competitive against them. Maybe you get that game to overtime or a shootout and you don't win the game, but you played them well. That's the type of thing you want to see. So I think that's the bigger thing moving forward here, especially with the week that comes up. You got 2 games that are going to start this week that look like they're there for the taking in some way. Florida's been better, but you've seen them before. You should know what's coming. You should know that you can't play wide open or as carelessly with the puck as you did it in the first meeting, because it led to a bunch of opportunities where you blew a 5-2 lead that forced overtime. You had to win the game in a shootout, and that was just a mess of a game that you somehow won. Then New Jersey, again, a team you've seen before, a team that you know what they have and what they'll bring to a game, and a team that's not exactly on the hot end right now. They're slumping a little bit. So take advantage of these next 2 games, and then prepare yourself for a battle against Tampa Bay. And keeping in mind, after Tampa Bay, there's 3 days off between the next game. And again, you're going to have a couple of games where you'll come up on a couple games here that are going to be measuring sticks too, because Toronto on the road is on there. That's definitely one. And I'm kind of curious to see how they play Buffalo after that too, because Buffalo's a team that has surprised some people with the way their record's been at the start of the year, and has also, for whatever reason, going to Buffalo has given the Flyers fits over the last few years. So maybe get those demons out of your head for a little bit and play a good game on the road in Buffalo, but also play against a team. The reason that it was so frustrating to watch them play like that in Buffalo is that Buffalo was no good for all those years. Now they've got a record that's respectable, and they've got more points than the Flyers do right now. So that bears in mind as well.
I agree with you in terms of this upcoming week. In terms of, if you've got a game that you want to really pick out, like that's the game that they should win this week. That's the New Jersey game because New Jersey is playing wretchedly. I've had to cut a few of their games. Their game against who was it? Was it San Jose? They looked absolutely terrible. Like they couldn't stop a beach ball. They couldn't do anything. It was an absolutely wretched game by them. And Kincaid's not playing well. Schneider's not playing well. They don't know what to do with their forwards. They sent Pavel Zacha down to the minors for some crazy reason. Earlier this week. That team is just, they don't know what's going on. So you want to be able to take advantage of that and not be the team that gives them confidence. Like, oh, hey, we just beat the Flyers in Philadelphia. And then they go on a hot streak because that happened. The Panthers give me worry just because if they're on a hot streak, I haven't seen too much of the Panthers lately. If they're on a hot streak and they're a team that you already can see, even if they weren't on a hot streak, that they would give the Flyers because of their speed, because of the fact that they can play both ends of the ice and they have relatively decent goaltending, that would be a potential pitfall for the Flyers. But that's definitely a bubble game. That's definitely a game that I think the Flyers can win, but definitely can see it going the other way. And then you have the tester, the difficult game, the game against Tampa Bay, the one that I fully expect the Flyers could lose. They could easily win it 4-3, like in a knockout, drag out type of fight. Or they can, lose 6-2 because Tampa Bay is just, absolutely dynamic offensively. I am curious too about that Buffalo game because I've seen Buffalo a couple times. I've had the misfortune of having to cut a couple Buffalo Montreal games, and Buffalo absolutely destroyed Carey Price. And some of those goals were not Carey Price's best attempts, but like Buffalo is not a slouch anymore. That's not a team you can just roll over anymore. And the Flyers haven't had that luck of rolling over Buffalo, particularly in Buffalo. But this is not a team that you're going to go in there and hammer because that connection of Eichel and Skinner is nothing to sneeze at. It's definitely something the Flyers are going to have to pay attention to because that line alone can lose you a hockey game if you're the Flyers. And then you have a back-to-back with the Rangers who stereotypically give the Flyers issues no matter where they play them. And then Toronto, which is a team that if you could lose that game 6-2 as well. That's definitely like, again, Toronto is just, they have too many guys. Like Nazem Kadri is their third line center. That's absolutely ridiculous. And with injuries to I think Austin Matthews, I don't know if he's still hurt, but you could just bump him up to the second line and you're really not second line center and you're still in trouble because you still have to worry about John Tavares and Nazem Kadri. Frederik Andersen is a decent enough goaltender where he can steal you a game. The Flyers don't have an easy Thanksgiving week, so they have to take advantage of this week the best they can.
Yeah, and it's funny that you bring up that stretch of games. There's 3 right over that part of the weekend because right after that they're going to close out the month of November against Ottawa. And again, that's a team that shouldn't give you as many fits. They're pretty dismal to start this season as well in some of those games, but they, the Flyers were a pretty vulnerable team after an 8-2 loss to San Jose, had to go play Ottawa, and you would think that that's the best medicine. They did score a whole lot in that game, but they gave up 4 goals too, and that was another game where the penalty kill was badly exposed. So that's a good point as well. I actually just had to check because you brought up the struggles of the New Jersey Devils. So I had to check, and it was kind of interesting because of the last several games, I mean, they won a game against Florida, which I guess at that point at the end of October wasn't really as much of a feat as it would seem, because Florida was really struggling until their recent 4-game winning streak. Their 4-game winning streak has brought their win total up to 6 for the season, and just considering how long it took Florida to get their first win, it's pretty impressive what they've been able to do in probably about a week and a half to turn it around. What ended up happening in that game, by the way, was New Jersey took an early 3-0 lead, ended up holding on 3-2. One of the goals for Florida was scored late. And since then, they have lost to Tampa 8-3, lost to Detroit 4-3, lost to the Islanders 3-0. So there was a quick 3-game losing streak right there. And just when you think that, they're in free fall mode, the Devils come out on the following Monday and completely take apart the Pittsburgh Penguins 5-1 in a game where the Penguins started losing all composure. Then they go out the next night and lose to Ottawa 7-3, and then 2 losses to Toronto, 6-1 on Friday, and Winnipeg 5-2 on Sunday. So, and that's all before. I know, by the way, their last game before coming to Philadelphia will be against Pittsburgh on Tuesday. So unless
I will note too that game against the Islanders,
yeah.
the 3-0 game,
Mhm.
Thomas Greiss didn't have to do a thing. I remember I had to cut that game, and I think he had to make one breakaway save, and like the Devil nearly shot it wide anyway. Like that was like you and I could have shut out the Devils that night. So like I get the premise that it's still not something to slouch at, because then they beat the Penguins pretty handily, but this is still a team that if you can catch them, if you play them the right way, they're still kind of like in a disaster type of mode. So you can still, like, that should be the game that if you win any game this week, that should be the one.
No, I'm with you because I mean, I kind of got to a point where I was starting to see the way that the Islanders were playing other teams and going, the Islanders aren't as bad of a team as maybe we all wanted to believe. Maybe it's the knock on them from the start of the season that, oh, they lost Tavares, so now they're not going to be a great team, and they're kind of trying to prove people wrong. They've had their moments, but still, I think it was funny with New Jersey because it started with when all these losing stretch for them started with the Tampa Bay game. You're going, well, it's Tampa Bay. There was nothing surprising about a team maybe giving up 8 goals to Tampa Bay. Everybody knows Tampa Bay's got that in them. But Detroit was not a team that ranked all that high, and the Islanders have been giving teams a fight in every game, really. And then to come back from that and beat Pittsburgh handily, and I mean, not only did they beat Pittsburgh, but Brian Boyle had a hat trick in that game. It was like it was kind of defying everything at this point that Brian Boyle was going to be your goal scorer in that situation. It wasn't Taylor Hall, it wasn't Nico Hischier, it wasn't Kyle Palmieri. It was Brian Boyle doing all that, and then to come out and look as horrible as they did against Ottawa, and then the 2 games over the weekend were just brutal for them.
That was the thing I was going to bring up, is that, yeah, they had that could have been a catalyst type of game, like type of win that you have against Pittsburgh, but then to absolutely get scorched by the Ottawa Senators, a team that if you get scorched by them, like, I know Brady Tkachuk's a pretty good, rookie hockey player. And they're like, they still have NHL's caliber players. I'm not trying to demean anyone on the Ottawa Senators, but to go out there and get scorched is that's concerning, especially since you have trouble in net. Corey Schneider is not Corey Schneider this season, and running with Keith Kincaid is not, that's not good for your health if you're the New Jersey Devils franchise. So yeah, it can definitely be trouble, and like, because it's the New Jersey Devils and they've been trouble for the Flyers since I was knee high to a duck. This team, that team looks like it's in trouble. That team looks like it's in trouble this season. Maybe not next season. Maybe they can turn it around sometime this season. Like, if Corey Schneider turns it on, Corey Schneider's still a really good goaltender, but as it stands right now, until he can find his game, that team, you got to look at that team as a team you can easily take a win from, as long as you show up and don't give them any kind of mojo.
Yeah, absolutely. This is going to be an interesting week. I mean, one of the things about this week is going to be trying to keep this momentum going through these first 2 games. Florida is not an easy one to overlook by any stretch. You don't want to overlook that game with how they've been playing lately, but you have seen them before. You have to have some knowledge of what this team can do to you, and a big part of that too is things with special teams as well. I mean, let's face it, special teams has not been great for the Flyers this year in both areas. I mean, the penalty kill was kind of no secret from the start, but the power play has not been great either. And there's still the other problem area to me is that there's still moments, it's been fewer and farther between, I guess, but there's still moments of games where you're not playing the full 60 and you're kind of surviving some of the waves. I mean, even in the Chicago win over the weekend, you play really not a great first 10 to 14 minutes of that first period, and a turnover gives you the first goal of the game. And from that point, you caught the vulnerable team that made the mistake. Duncan Keith makes a horrendous turnover, and Claude Giroux knows what to do with it, obviously. And after that happens, it looked like Chicago kind of hung their heads, and that was essentially from the second goal of the game. That was almost all she wrote from there. I mean, it's a totally different. It's kind of different watching that kind of team play against you, because how many times during that recent stretch were we saying the same thing about the Flyers? It would just snowball, and then they just kind of, all right, let's just put our heads down and game's over. So we'll just coast through the rest of this one and hope it doesn't look too bad by the end of it. And most of the time it would. But I think it's important to note that they're getting that they're getting the top line back in form. They're getting scoring from a lot of different sources. I've been really impressed with Scott Lawton throughout the year, but other players too. I mean, they're able to go through and utilize the fourth line in a certain way that makes it work and keeps it modestly effective. The third line's been pretty solid, all things considered. I mean, you even got to get a game-tying goal against Arizona in a game where you could have easily let the same thing that we were just talking about happen, where you gave up 3 quick goals in the second period. 2 of them were shorthanded, and at that point you're going probably going to put your head down and forget about the quick start that you had to go up 2-0 and let this one play out. And they didn't let it play out. Lawton scored the first goal of that third period rally, and then Dale Weiss scored the second one. And that's a fourth line goal and a third line goal if we're being technically reading into what the line combos are. But virtually that's 2 guys who were on your fourth line 2 years ago. And they're the ones pulling you out of that, and then your go-to guys in overtime play like your go-to guys in overtime and finish the job for you. It was a great shift by Jake Voracek, and Gostisbehere was in the right place and didn't really get all of the shot, didn't really put it on target necessarily. It hit a stick and rose up and went into the net, so that's how it works sometimes. But the fact that it looks like, for now at least, Brian Elliott's settling in as your goaltender. That if I think one of the points that you made, Dan, that's a great point out of the whole thing, is your defensive pairings are settling in really well. Radko Gudas is playing well with Travis Sanheim, and Christian Folan's been a great compliment to Shane Gostisbehere. And I think that separating Ivan Provorov and Shane Gostisbehere was a good move, because it allowed you to put a guy like Robert Haig on the pairing with Provorov, and it's a different dynamic there as well. That's a more physical presence, a guy who can kind of impose that size on the opponent and be more the stay-at-home variety, and not without still being willing to jump up in the play, because I haven't seen Haig not be willing to, but he's taken more of the stay-at-home role, and Provorov was able, over that little stretch of time since that's happened, they go out on that road trip, and Provorov gets his first couple goals of the season as a result of that, and being able to jump up on the play a little more. So it seems like it's working for everybody, and then presumably by the time you go into this big game on Saturday against Tampa Bay to really see where you are, presumably you'll have JVR back in the lineup, because he is closing in on it. He's probably not going to play on Tuesday. They practiced on Monday with him being the extra, so he probably won't play Tuesday against Florida. He didn't rule out Thursday against New Jersey, but it seems like there's not really much of a doubt that by the time Saturday rolls around and the Tampa game happens, he'll probably be back. And maybe there's a chance that you can get Raffle back in time for maybe that Toronto game a week later. It's not really as indicative. I mean, JVR had been skating for several days before this point, so it was kind of on track. Raffle, I don't know that, to my knowledge, he hasn't been skating yet. So Raffle, you're going to have to kind of wait on and see if he's available. I know the timeline was late November, early December, possibly. So he'd be closing in on a return soon. And all of that kind of contributes to a team being right there at the top of the Metro, and it's just a matter of whether or not they find a way to improve on all these areas that they haven't been playing so well in, special teams in particular. Because the thing about special teams to me is that the penalty kill has been a problem. We've talked about that already. The 9 straight games of allowing a power play goal that was broken up on Saturday, and only because you pitched a shutout. But otherwise, to me, the power play has been a little concerning too, just because that's an area where the Flyers could put a team away in some of these games, or it's an area where they would get an early advantage or find a way to pad a lead last season, because it was still very, very successful at times last season, especially when they were really clicking and playing well. They couldn't be stopped on the power play sometimes, and it has not been what it was last season. So I think that's something to keep in mind as well.
I'm not really too concerned about the power play, because the guys are there, and JVR is going to come back at some point, whether it's this Saturday or earlier or later. So you know that at some point the gears will start turning. Maybe they don't start turning in time, or maybe they start turning immediately. That's not really too much of a concern, because I know the right bodies are there. My biggest concern, and I'm glad you brought up special teams, because it was a point I wanted to bring up, is like it is a huge concern, just because if you give up less power play goals, obviously you have a better chance of winning. If they don't allow that power play goal against San Jose, they theoretically win that game, and that's an extra point that's down the line that will help you make the playoffs. And now you look and you see what can you possibly do to make this penalty kill any better. And the ideas that I'm seeing, or at least kicked around in my head, is I've seen, I think it was on NBC Sportsnet, NBC Sports Philadelphia, is the idea of potentially firing Ian LePerriere, which should be on the table at this point, because since he's been there, outside of his first year there, the penalty kill has gone from mediocre to terrible. And there were plenty of scapegoats initially. Pierre-Edouard Bellemare was one of them. Chris Vandevelde was one of them. And it's actually gotten worse since they've left. Um, and then the idea of, since I brought those two guys up, is what about the idea of just bringing in a guy, any player, that tilts a little bit more towards defense rather than offense? The Flyers have a bunch of guys that can score goals. They don't have a bunch of guys that are sound defensive forwards. So what about the idea of bringing in somebody that kind of veers more that way and can, be a penalty kill specialist, which is something that was chided by other Flyers media personnel, I will say, when Vandevelde and Bellemare were here.
I think you raise an interesting point with first of all, bringing those two names up again, because one of the things I think I've noticed is that, Belmar's not a terrible penalty killer with Vegas. I think it's just a method of the system. And the system kind of sets these guys up to fail in a way, because the system right now is win the opening face off of a power play, clear the puck immediately, and hope that they don't re-enter the zone and get set up, because once they do, it's so passive that you might as well give them all the time in the world and open the net up for them too while you're at it, because it's going to end up in there eventually with the way that you give them chances. Or at the very least, your goaltender is going to have to stand on his head to prevent a goal from being scored. Now, I will say this, on Saturday, as that Chicago game wore on, they took a couple of penalties down the stretch, I believe, in the third period. And in that particular stretch of the game, they were not sitting back on the penalty kill like they had been in every game I've seen previously. There was a little bit more of an aggressive nature to it, and it did have an effect. Now, I don't really think that there's a way to make that effective against a team like Tampa Bay. Tampa Bay is just going to go to work and do what they do, and you can have a guy playing right on top of the puck for half of it, and they've got enough skill to make that work too. It's against some of these teams, though, that don't necessarily have that, or don't rank as high because they're a little bit slower in moving the puck, or they limit themselves to one option. It's knowing how to take away that option. One of the things that's made things so easy for teams to score on the power play against the Flyers lately, to me, has been this idea, or this setup within this system, where the defensemen kind of play away from the crease a little bit and leave a guy standing in front of the net uncovered. Well, it's going to allow one of two things to happen. It's going to either allow a guy to get a rebound without having anybody on his back, or it's going to allow that player to create a screen that takes care of the eyes of the goaltender and leads to a goal that way. One way or the other, it's going to lead to a goal. And to me, I definitely see your point, Dan, about personnel too. And I think that one of the things about this is when Nick Aube-Kubel was called up, I think we all kind of thought that's the reason that he was called up. He was called up because he's been a guy who can probably come in and help the penalty kill. He can be a fourth line guy. He's not playing more than maybe 5 or 6 minutes a night if he's lucky. So maybe that's his use. You put him out there and give him penalty kill shifts. I do think that, and I'll say this prior to his injury as well, I think that Michael Raffl was playing pretty well in the penalty kill, and I think Scott Laughton's been great throughout, but that's only two forwards that you're talking about. You need Sean Couturier to be better and Claude Giroux to be better if he's going to be out there for a chunk of the PK. If he's not going to be out there for a chunk of it, then that's not really on him, but where are you going from there? Is it Dale Weiss that you're going with? Is it somebody else? Sometimes in years past, they had used Wayne Simmons out there. I don't know if I don't really recall that they've done that recently. I've seen more of Giroux, Couturier, Laughton, Weiss, and Jori Lehtera than anything else. But more or less, my point is that you keep rotating these same guys in, and here's a guy who kind of remains fresh on your bench as a fourth line guy, and you could throw him out there to try to be that guy. Aube-Kubel hasn't been bad in his time. It's just been so limited that you don't really get a chance to see how effective he can be. So you'd like to see that. I agree. I agree with you on your assessment of the power play as well, because eventually, and I think we started to see it in the Chicago game. They had a couple power plays where they did everything but score. So it'll come around. I think it's just the frustrating part of it is watching them make certain mistakes and or try to be too individual on the power play and not as much of a unit. I think against Chicago, you saw a power play unit trying to work together to find a way to score, and you just either would fire it just wide, miss the deflection didn't go on net, or you'd even get a good shot on goal and the rebound wouldn't be there for you, and somebody would clear that away or whatever. But you would have sustained pressure for longer, and that's a good sign. In terms of the power play figuring it out, I think the more concerning thing was situations like in the Arizona game where you put yourself in a spot where you can give up just one shorthanded goal, let alone two in the same game, and letting a mistake kind of snowball into something else again. I mean, that was a situation where that first one was something that was out of kind of everybody's control. Well, it was a missed. It wasn't a keep at the blue line by Gostisbehere there on a pass from Giroux, so he had to try to play it out in the neutral zone. But running into the official and having something happen from there, I mean, it happens. It's frustrating when it happens, but you have to regroup. And I don't know. My thought after that was that's when Dave Haxel should have taken the timeout. Take the timeout then, regroup them then. Don't let another shift go by and then find out that the same thing could happen again because of some lapse or whatever. Jake Voracek didn't back check well enough on Michael Grabner. And it's one of those situations where I look at Grabner and I go, why didn't the Flyers sign a guy like that? A guy who is known to be a PK guy. Now, Grabner's got more of an offensive skill set as a PK guy, but why didn't they go out and get a guy who was more of a known PK guy, in the offseason to try to improve it? I get trying to improve internally, but so far you've tried really just about every internal option you've got that makes sense, and it hasn't worked. So who's to say that you shouldn't have gone and tried to figure it out from the outside or shouldn't still do that if there's anybody out there, but I highly doubt that at this point of the season.
I will give the Flyers some sort of break against Arizona because they had one game where they held Arizona to no shorthanded goals, which is a feat apparently this season, because they had 7 shorthanded goals going into those 2 games with the Flyers. So to hold them to have those 2 shorthanded goals in Philadelphia, I think that was kind of more of a self-fulfilling prophecy that it was going to happen, because you had a power play that was it's not where it should be. It should probably be one of the elite power plays in the league, and it's still trying to find its footing. But Arizona, wow, they can just score on shorthanded, and they do it in a blink of an eye. One of them was kind of, as you said, Kevin, linesman related, but it's Arizona is really good shorthanded. That's a team that's definitely getting better. I think the only reason the Flyers beat them twice is because Antti Ranta was hurt. Antti Ranta's playing unbelievable this season before he got injured, and if he plays in those 2 games against the Flyers are kind of in trouble. They might still be able to win. I'm not going to poo-poo what the Flyers did on their road trip and what they've done so far coming back to Philadelphia, but I think it's a completely different game if Antti Ranta's playing. Especially, you had one goal where Kemper didn't even know where the puck was, and then Coyotes defenseman just pretty much passed it right to Sean Couturier. And you had that in the Chicago game too, where Duncan Keith had a beautiful assist to Claude Giroux. The only problem was they're not on the same team, so it's called the turnover.
Yeah. Duncan Keith didn't have a good game on Saturday, period. I mean, he had one turnover. The turnover on the Giroux goal was basically a backhand pass right to the tape of Giroux, so it was a nice setup. He had trouble. He mishandled the puck at the blue line on Couturier's first goal, which was which was on the tail end of a penalty kill for the Flyers. And then even on Couturier's second goal, you can credit another Chicago defenseman because Brandon Manning put it into his own net.
Probably still thought he was a Flyer.
Yeah. Well, I said in the press box when I was up there at that point too. It's not the first time a shot went off of his sticking into his own net, and it was right away, it was fully knowing it was met with Drew Stafford, right? Yep, Drew Stafford. Yeah, we don't forget things easily. Just like every time Patrick Kane's on the ice in Philadelphia, don't go there.
Yeah. That was also it was interesting watching that Flyer Chicago game. Not to harp on it, just because that looked like a defeated Chicago team. I know they had a couple chances early, and particularly in the third period when the Flyers decided, yeah, we're up 3-0, and you guys can't score, so we're just gonna turtle shell. But like even in the beginning when they were on the power play, I'm like, they're not even, and I knew the score. I was still like, this is the slowest power play I've ever seen. Like they're passing it slowly, they're moving it, they're moving their body slowly. This is not. I don't know how you're going to score on the power play when you play it like this. And like, it was funny because when you look at the little graphic on the bottom, it says like, oh, the Flyers were 30th in penalty killing, the Chicago Blackhawks are 30th in power play, and I'm like, well, if you have an inept power play, it makes it really easy for if you're still a bad penalty killing team, and that's what it looked like to me, at least.
Well, it was funny too because we were watching that first power play for Chicago, one of the first ones anyway, and it was kind of the question was, did they do any film work on the Flyers penalty kill, because Chicago didn't have a guy at net front. They played everybody at the perimeter, and it was like, you realize what happens when a player stands right in front of the net against the Flyers penalty kill right now, right? He gets pretty much left alone to do whatever he wants to there and take the goalie's eyes, and they had nobody there. And it is a defeated team, because when Patrick Kane's virtually disappearing from a game, which the only reason I think I realized that he was on the ice in most of these situations was because of the fact that in the third period they had shifted up the lines and moved Patrick Kane from the second line that he had been playing on throughout the last game or so, and put him on the same line as Jonathan Toews and Alex DeBrincat, and it didn't do anything for Chicago for the rest of the game. And by that point, at 2-0, I mean, the interesting thing is that at 2-0, it wasn't a secret that Chicago was realistically a one-line team with Kane and Taves, and DeBrincat's a good young player, but beyond that, they don't have near as much scoring depth. Brandon Saad didn't play in the game with an injury, so that was another damaging blow to Chicago's depth. And to watch them go out there though, and not even be able to put it together in a sense where, yeah, it's one of those things, you have to know the opponent a little bit. And I don't care if the Flyers were riding a 5-game winning streak or were still on their losing streak from the previous homestand. Whatever. You got to play the team as if the next goal is going to completely deflate the efforts. At 2-0, the next goal could shake up the whole game, and 2-1 could have made a big difference in this game. Instead, the Flyers are the team that gets the fortunate bounce, and at 3-0, that it was only less than 5 minutes into the third period, it was 3-0, and the game was virtually over from there. And it kind of was, they went through the motions for the rest of that game from there, for sure.
November is a really bad time to quit when you're a hockey team. It's just
Yeah.
you got a lot of hockey to play if you've already quit. I don't even see that in LA. Like LA's already fired their coach. They can't score, but they're trying. At least they're trying to play. I don't, and it's weird too because you have Jonathan Toews on that team, and you figured that there would be an effort. You figured that like he would at least force people, like, guys, play. Like, could you at least try? And I don't know if it's just to the point where it's like, you know what, I got my rings. There's nothing else I can do with this team. We're at that stage, or if it's just universal and everyone's just like, yeah, we're bad, and there's no hope. If you're a Blackhawks fan, you kind of hope you get Jack Hughes, and a new stage of the Blackhawks can begin. But also, like, side note, I have no sympathy for that organization. You got 3 cups. You get bent. You've had your fun.
Well, body language says a whole hell of a lot. Jonathan Toews was as visually frustrated as I can remember, and I even said, they call him Captain Serious for a reason. He does take the game very seriously, but when you're winning, it's fun too. This doesn't look fun for him anymore by any stretch. And Patrick Kane looked like he was going through the motions. Duncan Keith is a shell of himself. Brent Seabrook saw more limited ice time than I can ever remember seeing him in a game for Chicago, at least in Philadelphia. Things like that. Like, they're down so many players. DeBrincat was taken right out of the play. Maybe that's a size factor thing on him because he is such a small player, but he was fairly ineffective. The best player Chicago had in that game was Nick Schmaltz, and he had 2 or 3 really good chances to score. He hit the post once and had 2 more where Elliott took away the angle, really aggressively took away the angles on his shots. And that was kind of the difference. But other than that, That was, I mean, it was a relative cakewalk for a good stretch of the game for the Flyers, just and especially for Elliott. They kept them to the outside, and there wasn't a whole lot of opportunity. And when there was, Elliott was ready for it. So it's how these games go sometimes. But you don't want to, you don't go into the next game thinking it's going to be like that. So take that one and put it behind you, and take the win and the 2 points and all the good things that have happened over the last 2 weeks. But there's no stopping the work at this point. You know, you've put yourself in a hole early in the year with the way October went. You're having a pretty strong November so far. It's a November that's reminiscent to me of the way that December started to go last season for the Flyers, and the way February went for the Flyers. Where last February the Flyers virtually couldn't lose. It felt like, and then when they got to the end of February, right around the time that they made a trade to pick up a goaltender that you thought was going to be the driving force behind making a playoff push, everything fell apart. But they had at least two stretches last season where they were playing very well and virtually couldn't lose in some of those games. Even in the games where they would start off slow or go through those motions where things would fall apart a little bit, they would find a way back and find a way to win some games. So keep that momentum going, and who knows what this can turn into. I mean, you're about to go into a game day here where you're pretty much you're either going to be second or third in the division pending the outcome of a couple games, but you also could be in a position where the division lead could be up for grabs by the time tomorrow's game is over. By the time Tuesday's game's over, you could have a shot at the division lead. So it's interesting to say 2 weeks down the line from a team that was at the bottom of the division and didn't look like it was going anywhere, but such are the ebbs and flows of a hockey season, you know? So that's how it goes sometimes.
It is interesting how they went from a team where everyone was demanding changes, either it was Hackstall or Nylander, and some people are still, demanding LaPerriere be removed. But now you don't really have to play into that anymore because you've won a few games. You can see how the rest of this month goes. You're still very much in play for the division because it's the beginning of the season still, and you don't have to hit any kind of panic button. You don't have to be like the Kings or the Blackhawks where things have just fallen apart at the seams. You can stay in the pocket of what you're trying to do for this season and moving forward. And, just to circle back around to what we've talked about, now we want to kind of see where this team is. Are they the good team that just beat a bunch of bad teams in Arizona on this road trip? Or are they a great team that's just coming into stride now, and they can kind of prove it this week by, getting 2 wins against teams that, you know, they have a division rival in the Devils, and they have a Florida Panthers team that can give you trouble, and they should be a playoff team, but they're also not playing particularly well in the beginning of the season. And then you have the Tampa Bay Lightning. This is kind of like a stretch where you can prove, like, all right, we're not that team in October anymore. This is the team we're going to be for the rest of the season.
You had that chance early in the season too. When the first meeting against Florida went the way that it did, and you were making a statement against a team that didn't win a game all season to that point, and go up 5-2, but then find a way to allow them back into the game and force overtime. That kind of showed where the team was in October. Same thing with, the Columbus game was another one that was kind of a disaster throughout and had its moments, and you played way too wide open. Things of that nature. It's those kind of games. So nothing's safe here. I think the leash is still a little short here just because you never want to feel comfortable in November. I do think that the Flyers benefited from having some adversity early in the year. When the 10-game losing streak rolled around last season, it was around this time, it was through the middle of November into December, not the very beginning of the season. So you didn't have time to kind of pump the brakes on that too and go, it's 5 games into the season or 10 games into the season. There's a lot of time left to turn this back around and to at least show that it was more of a players thing than it was maybe a coaching thing. If the players can put games together like they did against Chicago, or put together a third period rally like they did against Arizona, or go on the road and win 3 out of 4 games and carry momentum throughout the road trip and do things differently after all the talk that happened after that Islander game, then maybe it is on the players. But how quickly it can shift back to something else, to other factors, if things aren't improving. Quick starts are probably part of preparation in some way. So if all of a sudden the quick starts turned around, maybe Dave Axtell's got this team more prepared to come out and start playing at the beginning of a game, or to weather the storm at the beginning of a game and not make mistakes and let those opportunities come to you, because they have over the course of these 6 games. But it can quickly turn around. I think all the talk about Ian LaPerriere being potentially on the chopping block, or people who want to see that happen because of the penalty kill, I think that's valid. If something's not working, you have to find a reason, not a reason to fix it, but you need to find the reason behind why you would go about making a change. If it's not personnel, and if you don't think it's personnel, and you don't think it's, or if you don't think it's system, that'll determine which direction you go. Do you add a player to help your penalty kill, or do you change up the whole game here and do something different with the system? It can there's a lot of different ways it can go. So that to me is where that would go, and it's going to be a good, but it's going to be a good week. It's going to be a good week to see where this team is in the next 3 games. Florida's been on the rise a little bit over the course of the last week. New Jersey has not, and that's a divisional matchup where, as it would be in a lot of different sports, divisional games are a little different because there's more energy behind them. And New Jersey could be looking at these 2 games that they've got coming up this week, Pittsburgh first on Tuesday and then the Flyers on Thursday, and going, people don't think much of us right now, but let's see what happens if we play 2 really good games within the division, especially for how tight the standings are. Could totally change the whole picture again. And then Tampa being the class of the Eastern Conference right now, no question about it. No, I don't think there's anybody who would argue that based on the way they've started the season. And the only thing that I find interesting about the Tampa game is that at this point, typically Tampa's been firing on all cylinders. Everybody knows about the weapons they've got, and everybody knows how, don't give them power play time. The power play is lethal. They're good shorthanded. They're a team they've got one, arguably one of the best goal, easily probably a top 3 goalie in the league at this point. And yet they're also a team that, it seems like when they've lost a game, they don't just lose a game. They absolutely get throttled. They've lost 4 games in regulation this season. They lost to Vancouver 4-1. They lost to Arizona 7-1. They lost to Nashville 4-1, and they lost to Ottawa 6-4 in a game that really went back and forth. Actually, in a game where Tampa carried a 4-2 lead against Ottawa, and Ottawa scored 4 goals in the third period. So when they've lost, it hasn't been pretty. So if you can kind of make a lot of noise against that team and hold them down a little bit, I mean, who's to say that you're not going to get one of these crazy games like they had in Tampa a year ago, where it was a 7-6 final and a shootout, and that went back and forth like crazy, and goals were being scored throughout. You could get one of those. You could get a low scoring, well contested game. So it could go either way, but that should be a fun one.
I do like the idea of Brian Elliott using this game against Chicago to get his game in order, but you are right in terms of having those games where the other team just didn't look sharp, didn't play sharp, having seeped. Let me rephrase this. You run the risk of that seeping into your game, and then that potentially could spell doom for them against the Panthers. You're absolutely right again with the Devils. The Flyers have had situations where they played the Devils, and the Devils have had jam, and they haven't. And with Tampa Bay, I mean, you can easily pick them off because nothing's impossible in the NHL. There's parity. It's not like this is college football and it's Appalachian State playing against Michigan. Oh wait, that's actually been an upset. But you can easily see the Flyers winning that game. But there's also just the way the matchups work. The way the Flyers defenses work, the way the Flyers goaltending may form going into that game. It could also be a disaster. So you just have to kind of see how everything turns out. See how the Flyers play against New Jersey and Florida, and it's pretty much a really wait and see type approach for Tampa Bay. And it's an afternoon game, so Tampa Bay could have 2 bloodshot eyes, while the Flyers have been playing afternoon games all season. So that could also be in the Flyers' favor. Could not. It's really just up in the air, particularly when you're only 2 months into the season. So it's still a good way to scope out where the Flyers are. I thought the Flyers kind of answered the bell against Boston a couple weeks ago. They just had a couple mistakes, and that kind of spelled that just that gave them the loss in that game. Um, but if the Flyers play like that, if the Flyers play the way they played against Boston, against Tampa, just with a few goals, I think they definitely could come away with that game.
Yeah, I'll to wrap up, I'll just say a couple quick things based on what you just said too. One thing that I think helped Brian Elliott kind of find his game a little bit here in these last couple is coming into a game against Arizona where he had no room for error and having to play spotless hockey in goal for, at that point, the final 35 minutes of the game. Roughly, he had to play perfect from there to give them any shot of coming back in that game, because it was at a point when they were one goal against away from folding it up for the night, probably. And he kept them in that game in the times that he needed to. And as they chipped away in the third period and they got it back to within one and then eventually tied the game, it set them up for a win. He carries that momentum into the Chicago game, goes out, posts a shutout against, it wasn't the most challenging effort, but he made some decent saves throughout the game. I mean, it wasn't like it went without being tested at all. So he made some good saves in that one. So that's a good one. My other kind of concern about the Tampa game is that I do think that I wonder how that would go if that's going to be JVR's first game back in the lineup, because you really don't want a guy who has to shake off the rust a little bit for in a game setting against the best team in the Eastern Conference and arguably the league at this point, and I say arguably in the league because, Tampa's got to compete with the likes of Nashville. Toronto's been good. They haven't been quite on Tampa's level, but Toronto's been good. But Nashville and Tampa kind of go back and forth as that team for most of the time anyway. But to get a guy like that back and to potentially put him on a line that's given such big defensive responsibilities, that's a little concerning, just because that line is probably going to have to find a way to protect against the likes of a Stamkos or a Kucherov or somebody like that, and kind of good luck in that situation. You don't want JVR's first game back to have to be such a defensive struggle. He's there to be he's here for production. He's here for production, and that's what you want him to be. But it's going to be really hard to find that production in your first game back if it's against Tampa. I think he would have much more success if he came back and shook off the rust in the first period against the Devils and then had 2 periods to find his game beyond that and had a little bit under his belt for the Tampa game. But Tampa, like you said, it's an afternoon game. Maybe Tampa comes in and is a little sleepy to those afternoon games. Tampa will also have been on the road for a little bit of a stretch there. I think they play a road game on that Thursday as well in Pittsburgh. So you get a team that's had to travel a little bit that isn't home. The Flyers have been sitting at home for the last week at this point. From coming home following that Arizona game on Monday to having a home game on Thursday, home game Saturday, and 3 more this week. They haven't gone anywhere. They're practicing from the comforts of home. And, it was funny. That was something that the team said was a distraction or could be a distraction or could lead to certain things on home ice that doesn't happen on the road because you block things out a little more. Maybe that's also going to help them in some of these games where they're the team that's been home and the team that's been able to just kind of go about routine life a little bit and not have to be anywhere, especially after a road trip, and they're ready to go and ready to play against these teams that are coming in. Maybe that's how it goes. And that's going to do it for this episode of the Flyerdelphia podcast. We want to thank everyone for listening. Be sure to subscribe to the Flyerdelphia podcast. Again, we are on iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, and Spotify. Subscribe to our YouTube channel. We'll have a video preview going up for Tuesday's game against Florida sometime on Tuesday, early on Tuesday. It's also included. We also include that video as part of the game previews on sportstalkphilly.com, so you can check that out as well. Also, remember that we are on SoundCloud as part of the Sports Talk Philly podcast network. You can listen to us and shows on the rest of Philly sports through that podcast network. There's the Phillies Nation podcast on Sports Talk Philly covering the Phillies, the Pick Swap pod covering the Sixers, and the Kelly Green Boys covering the Eagles. All 3 of those guys might have a lot to talk about very soon. So those shows are certainly ones to keep an eye on as well. We're here for you for Flyers hockey. They are here for the rest of the sports in the city. Next week, we will look at the remainder of the homestand before the Flyers head out for one quick road game in Buffalo and the Thanksgiving weekend back-to-back, one at home, one on the road as well. But we'll look at all that, the remainder of the homestand, where the Flyers sit after that after the 5-game homestand and as the all-important marker of Thanksgiving comes up next week. So once again, thank you for tuning in. For Dan Heaning, I'm Kevin Durso, and this has been the Flyerdelphia podcast on sportstalkphilly.com. This has been the Flyerdelphia podcast, part of sportstalkphilly.com, with Kevin Durso, Rob Riches, and Dan Heaning.